An Introduction to Prevalence. By the end of this session, you should be able to define prevalence, calculate prevalence, and understand how it is used in epidemiology. Prevalence is a key concept in epidemiology. It is defined as the measure of how many people have a disease or health condition in a specific population at a given time. Prevalence is usually stated as a percentage of the total number of people in the population being studied. For example, the prevalence of blindness in the Gambia in 1996 was found to be 1.3%. It is important to remember that prevalence is not a rate. In epidemiology, before you can do any assessment, it is important to specify what is being studied. We call the person with the disease or condition a case. A case can be a disease, such as trachoma, a health problem, such as obesity, or a condition, such as myopia. And it is very important to accurately define what the case is. For example, you could be doing a study on cataract, but you have to define, are you looking at age-related cataract or congenital cataract? It doesn't matter what the case is, as long as it's clearly defined. To calculate the prevalence of a disease, we need to know two numbers. One, the total number of people in the population we are studying. We call this the denominator. A handy reminder for this is D for down. Two, the number of people with a disease at a specific time. We call this the numerator. To calculate the prevalence, we divide the number of people with the disease, the numerator, by the total study population, the denominator. Prevalence can be presented as a proportion, from 0 to 1, or as a percentage. Where does the denominator come from? The primary sources of denominator data are the most recent national census data and population registers. It is vital to have reliable denominators. Where does the numerator come from? Various sources of routinely collected data are available for use, for example, birth and death registrations, or through examination of a study population for the defined case. The availability and quality of data may vary greatly between countries and within countries. We have already said that the primary sources of denominator data are national census data and population registers. In epidemiology, it is not always possible to study the whole population to obtain the prevalence of a disease. Instead, a technique called sampling is used and information extrapolated to the population. We will look at this in detail in later sessions. Some epidemiological studies look at a specific disease or condition that only affects certain groups, such as women, children, or a specific blood type. For example, let us consider a school with 50 children where 5 pupils are wearing spectacles. To calculate the prevalence, we divide 5 by 50 and then multiply by 100 to get a percentage. This gives us a prevalence of 10% for spectacle-wearing children at this school. As another example, let's look at the prevalence of diabetic retinopathy in Equatorial Guinea. To calculate the prevalence of diabetic retinopathy in Equatorial Guinea, we need to know 3 numbers. First, the total population of the country. This is 750,000. Next, the number of people with diabetes. This is 12,000. And finally, the number of people with diabetic retinopathy. This is 1,500 people. To calculate the prevalence of diabetes, we divide 12,000 by 750,000 to get the proportion of the population with diabetes, and multiply by 100 to give a percentage, which is more user-friendly. This gives us a prevalence of diabetes of 1.6% in Equatorial Guinea. Knowing the prevalence in the total population is useful for estimating the health costs of diabetic retinopathy. However, it is more important for eye health professionals to know the prevalence of diabetic retinopathy amongst people with diabetes. The reason for this is that it shows the actual size of the problem, as only people with diabetes are at risk of diabetic retinopathy in Equatorial Guinea. To calculate the prevalence of diabetic retinopathy, we divide 1,500 by 12,000 and multiply by 100. That is, we divide the number of people with diabetic retinopathy, which is 1,500, by the number of people at risk, which is the number of people with diabetes, which is 12,000. This gives us a prevalence of diabetic retinopathy amongst diabetes patients of 12.5% in Equatorial Guinea. It is important to remember that, in this case, we do not use the total population of 750,000 as the denominator. Not all of the 750,000 are at risk of diabetic retinopathy, only those with diabetes. Prevalence information can also be mapped to show where the need is the greatest. For example, as shown in this trachoma map, the areas where active trachoma is most prevalent will benefit from mass distribution of azithromycin. Prevalence data as the measure of disease occurrence is usually obtained from cross-sectional studies. Cross-sectional studies can be thought of as a camera snapshot, as they collect information from individuals at one point in time. Population prevalence gives you the burden of a disease in a country. You can also measure prevalence in other settings, for example, prevalence in a village. In this case, the denominator is the population of the village. Prevalence in the clinic. In this case, the denominator is the number of clinic attendees during the period you are measuring. Collecting prevalence data. National eye health plans should collect data on prevalence of visual impairment through Rapid Assessment of Avoidable Blindness, or RAB surveys. RAB is a rapid survey methodology developed by the International Centre for Eye Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. RAB is a tool that can be used to determine the prevalence of blindness in the 50+ age group. Health workers can use prevalence data to measure the impact of health services by collecting prevalence data before and after a health intervention. For example, how much of a change did providing cataract surgery have on reducing blindness in a given population? In summary, prevalence is a measure of the burden of disease in a population, as it is the proportion of the population with the disease at a specified time. Prevalence data allows us to understand and quantify disease burden and health outcomes. Health workers can use this information to allocate resources appropriately within a health service.